Okay, welcome everybody to semester 2 with a whole lot of exciting more learning units for you. Some nice learning units this semester, but again, they're a little bit all over the place. You get a good taste of a lot more topics in this semester, which is always interesting, and a lot of them are quite applicable to our everyday situations, which is great. So has anyone got any questions right now before we start? I have put all the dates up on the calendar for you when we'll have our collabs. I have looked at the PAS document. I've seen when the assignments are due. I've put those on the calendar. Your exam date is on the calendar. Your last assignment you write quite late. I got them to move it back a week because it was really way too close to the exam, but they could only move it back a week. So there's not much time between the last assignment and the exam, but hopefully it'll help with exam prep. But I think your first assignment is due in September, and we will cover all the material in time. So hopefully if you've got any questions on anything on the calendar, you can just let me know. I've put links to the ICE tasks up under the more resources folder. I've also put extra videos under the learning unit more resources specifically for this module. So please take a look at some of those extra resources because they will help explain some of these theorists in this section, make it a little bit clearer for you. So if you're all good, then we'll crack on with this first learning unit on chapter 10. It's quite a lengthy learning unit. So I'll try to focus on some of the more critical areas, but there is quite a bit of reading that you need to do in order to make sure you understand this section. So this section is on development across the lifespan. Okay, so it really spans from the moment of conception all the way through up until really death, and looking at the different progress people make developmentally in certain areas. We have quite a large focus on early childhood and adolescence because obviously that's a critical area for development. So your learning outcomes are plenty. You've got 15 different learning outcomes in your module guide. So please make sure that you really do check off each of those learning outcomes. We go from the prenatal stage to early childhood around the different developmental components in early childhood. We look at personality and cognitive development in childhood, the transition to adolescence, and then the expansive adulthood. So there are quite a lot of learning units. I will try to get through as much as I can this evening. If I do run over, then I'll put the last bit up as a recording. So don't fear, we will cover as much as we need to help you with this module. So again, any questions for anyone who's new, you can pop up your hand or just pop them in the chat and we will get to them during the course of this session. Okay, so use your module outline. It's very important. So we're talking about development and developmental psychology, really. And when we talk about development, what do we mean? Development is basically about changes in behavior that happen over the lifespan that really correlate with growth and maturation. So it's very much age related, starting from conception until death. So it's a lifelong process that we have to consider when we're talking about development. And when we talk about development, we talk about it really in 3 different primary areas. One is physical development, where we talk about motor skills, that's coordination, gross motor development, arms, legs, whatever it might be, the psychophysiological processes that link to that. We think about cognitive development, which is around language development, problem solving, and being able to have conceptual understanding. And we also talk about social and emotional development. A key part of that is personality, around identity formation and self-concept. So all of those areas of development are relevant across the lifespan. Okay, they don't just belong in young children. Those changes happen across the lifespan, which is why we talk about it being a developmental process from conception until death. So when we speak about development or developmental psychology, we look at the life cycle as you can see in the picture there, from the fertilized egg right the way through the life cycle until death. And most of the way development is proposed is like stage theories. Okay, so there's different periods in our lives, and within those periods there are also different stages, and that is how we construct ourselves. So it's very much a stage-like approach. But what causes the change, we also have to consider from what we call an interactionist perspective. So there's always going to be interplay between biology and the environment, okay, that triggers some of those changes or plays a key role in some of those changes. But ultimately, we talk about development in stages. So if we define a stage to start with, because this word will come up quite often, it's a developmental period during which characteristic patterns of behavior are exhibited and certain capacities become established. And often you'll find that stages need to be progressed through in order, okay? And each stage builds on the previous stage. And often the progression through those different stages of development is linked to age. Okay, so that's just understanding the stage. When we talk about stages, it's like a developmental progression. And the second stage depends on the completion of the first stage. Obviously, the lines between stages can be a bit blurred and there can be some transitional periods, but we talk often about stage-like development. So let's start right at the beginning, okay? And we start right at conception. From the minute that that sperm fuses with that egg is really where the developmental journey starts. And so that process of conception to birth, or a duration of a pregnancy, is 40 weeks. So again, this might sound a little bit like a life science lesson, and I'm not going to go into too much detail here. That there's some more information in your textbook, but it's quite straightforward, just understanding how the development takes place. So it's really important in that prenatal phase to look at the interaction between biological environmental factors. And we dig into that a little bit, especially around the influence of when the child is in the womb, those prenatal influences on development, and very much a relationship between what's happening inside the womb and what is happening outside the womb can have a significant impact on that prenatal development process. So with the stage, it's broken into 3 different significant stages. During pregnancy, you start with the germinal stage, which is the minute conception happens and that little embryo is implanted on the uterine wall. That generally lasts about 2 weeks. Then you have the embryonic stage, which is where the organs start to form, the basic body organs start to form, and that's a very vulnerable time. It's usually about 2 weeks to 2 months, and that's often why only once a mother has passed sort of 12 weeks of pregnancy is it really safe to assume that you've got a healthy pregnancy, or a pregnancy that is going to last the duration of the 40 weeks. Some people are hesitant to announce their pregnancy until after that 12-week window. So that embryonic stage is very crucial. And the final stage is the fetal stage, and that's really where the baby starts to grow and develop. And that is from 2 months right through to the end of your pregnancy. And in terms of a pregnancy process, after week 24, you would have a viable baby. If you go into labor before about the 24th week, generally you don't have a fetus that is going to survive, and it won't have it will have to go on to sort of premature support, but it could be too premature. So basically, your viability of your fetus really is after the 24th week. So you just need to understand those 3 different stages. And obviously, at each stage in that process, there are vulnerabilities to that unborn child. Okay, and we'll have a look at what some of those are. So you just need to just have a clear indication of how that process happens. So like I said, once that baby is in the womb, okay, there are influences that can take place that really influence that prenatal development, because the baby and the mother are linked through the placenta. And the mother's behavior can affect the baby dramatically. So what kind of things can impact on that unborn child? So we break it down into different kinds of factors that can influence the prenatal development process. You have genetic factors, which are things like gene abnormalities. So that's faulty genes being transferred from one generation to the next. So that can result in something like a child being born with spina bifida. That's due to the fact there was a genetic abnormality. You can also have chromosome abnormalities, which is where there's a segment of irregular DNA, and that can cause something like Down syndrome. So those we call genetic factors. There are also diseases that can be transmitted through heredity. So things like heart disease or diabetes. Often, you know, when you go into a doctor's room for something, they'll check your family history. So sometimes some of those issues can be carried through from one generation to the other. So genetic and heredity factors can have impact on that on the developing fetus. Obviously, nutrition is critical. So what the mother ingests, because the baby is supported through the placenta, what the mother ingests is critical for the development of the child. So therefore, there has to be a nutrient-rich environment in order for the baby to grow optimally. So that means not just consuming the right kind of food, but you also have to consume sufficient food. Okay, it also means that your supplements and your vitamins are also important. So the baby has to have sufficient nutrition so it meets those required growth trajectories. Maternal stress and emotion. So obviously, mums are under a great deal of stress or anxiety, and anything that disrupts that hormone balance, because that's what our reaction to stress is. Okay, we learned about stress hormones, and they can impact on the unborn child. So high levels of those stress hormones, such as cortisol, can result in a baby being born. Possibly it leads to hyperactivity, a decreased immune response, and also a low birth rate. So having a mother during pregnancy that is relaxed and not going through any kind of environmental stresses is important for the well-being of the child. Drug use, I'm sure you have heard this often. So mothers who ingest alcohol can lead to mental and physical deficiencies in the child. The child can actually be born with fetal alcohol syndrome, which means that they then also have to start to withdraw from alcohol once they're born. Impact of smoking can result in lower birth weights in children and also have long-term developmental consequences in cognition and various other things like ADHD and antisocial behavior. Marijuana and cocaine, again, not healthy to the child. The child can be born with an addiction already and goes through those withdrawal symptoms once they're born. And any kind of maternal illness or psychopathology, such as HIV/AIDS, okay, those significant illnesses in adulthood can have an impact on the unborn child. So maternal, sorry, I seem to have repeated that, but maternal illness as well. We talk about in psychopathology, we talk about mental health. So depression and anxiety in the mother can also affect the unborn child. The influences of culture and family have an impact on the unborn child. There could be living in situations of poverty, could lead to depression. So the socio-cultural sort of situation a mother finds themselves in is impactful. And environmental toxins. So we've heard that things like air pollution, cell phone towers give off radioactive waves, and pesticides in the air. All of those kinds of environmental toxins can be linked to things like low birth weight and developmental delays with children. So keeping the mother in an environment where we try to minimize those factors that can impact on development is critical. Okay, and I think in your first assignment, you've got a question on this particular section of work. Okay, there's a lot of research around it. There are other factors, but these are the main ones that we consider at this point. So after the child is born, we move into the early childhood phase, and this is the most critical time in in somebody's life is these first years. It's where there's rapid change, and the change is big and it happens rapidly. Okay, so during infancy, changes in body size are rapid. By the end of the first year, infant's height is 50% more than birth, and at 2, it's 75% greater. The weight doubles by 5 months and triples by a year and quadruples at the age of 2. So the child grows rapidly, okay, in those first few years of life. And at the same time, it's a critical time for brain development as well. Most of our brain formation, our neurons, all happen in those first 2 years of life. So when we talk about development in early childhood, we talk about motor development. So that's moving from not being able to move from side to side to a point where a baby can turn over, start to crawl, start to sit up, and start to walk. Okay, so that's what we mean by motor development. So it's basically the progression of muscular coordination, that they start to get more control over their limbs and over their bodies. So it's the ability to move in their physical skills. Obviously, early on in their lives, it's very much hampered by their proportions. But as they start to grow and proportions start to develop, they start to gain more physical control of their own bodies. It's very much driven by genetics. There's almost a genetic blueprint of developmental milestones that physical development happens over, and very much based on a developmental norm. So milestones are really driven by biology. Okay, it's a natural process that a child grows, but there are environmental influences that can impact on that growth. So once parts of the nervous system sufficiently mature, they learn to develop new skills with very little practice. And again, cultural variations around physical motor development. Certain cultures might limit a child's movement, but the more you allow a child to explore the world around them, the better their physical development is going to become. So motor development itself depends on physical growth, as well as the process of maturation, which is that unfolding of the blueprint, as well as the infant's ongoing exploration of the world. So those three things come together to really support motor development in children. So those are the developmental norms. So often when you have a baby and you take them to the clinic and they measure them, even schools measure your children, especially in preschools, to really look at their developmental stages. Okay, so they have identified various ages and stages at which certain motor development should be occurring. And if your child is not achieving those progressive stages, then that's when you might have a referral, for example, to an occupational therapist or some kind of therapist to see if there is a physical problem. So from the age of 2, for example, some of those milestones is at the age of 2, a child should be able to kick a ball and walk up and down the stairs. We call that gross motor because that's your big muscles. Okay, but you also have fine motor development, which is your small muscles like holding a pencil or a crayon or being able to stack blocks. So we have developmental milestones that happen that really evolve over a period of time with encouragement, with support, and your child should be able to achieve those milestones. Okay, so that's what we call motor development, and its critical developmental stages in the early years. Temperament is something very different. Temperament is like a personality, and children are born with a certain temperament, and a temperament is like a mood. Okay, you might hear somebody say, I had a very temperamental child. I had a very difficult child when she was a baby. It's almost like the child is born with a certain temperament. So 3 styles of temperament have been identified. An easy temperament, so that's a little child who's very happy, regular in their sleep patterns, they generally eat well and are not easily upset. Then you have children who are possibly a little bit slower to warm up, and then you have children who are born with a difficult temperament. Generally, those children are irritable and resistant to change. But what really happens is there's a fusion between all 3 temperaments. You can't really put a child in a box. But the temperaments that children are born with are relatively stable over time. there can be some changes, and it's also been shown that heredity can be an influence on that. And sometimes when we get to the psychological disorders, you might see that the word temperament comes into some of those psychological disorders around a kind of personality that the child is born with from a very early age. So that's what temperament means when we see that word again. Okay, so it's just a case of understanding the term. It's the child is born with a certain temperament, not necessarily being able to be put in a box. It's often a fusion of those three different kinds of temperaments. Now we move on to something called attachment. This links to emotional development. So we've looked at physical development, we've looked at temperament, and now we're going to look at emotional attachment or emotional development. So when a child is born, there's an emotional bond, and it's linked between the infant and its primary caregiver. So the primary caregiver is usually, in most cases, the mother. And that's where that first primary strong attachment happens. And a key factor in that attachment taking place is really once mobility starts to happen in the second half of the first year of the baby's life. And the way it's looked at is mainly in reaction to strangers. So once a stranger is introduced to a situation and the mother is present, it's the child's response to that stranger which will give you an indication of the attachment to the mother. So around 6 to 8 months, if you've got a child and the mother leaves, there can be something called separation anxiety, which is that emotional distress that a child will exhibit when they're sort of separated from somebody that they have formed an attachment with. So we talk about an attachment theory, and that really measures the emotional responsiveness of the child in this particular time. So there's a couple of different theorists that have come in here speaking about attachment theory. Bowlby was the first one who came into play with his theory of attachment, and he saw attachment, the attachment of an emotional attachment between a child and its mother, as part of an evolutionary mechanism. It's a biological mechanism geared at survival. So it's about the child having proximity-seeking behaviors to keep caregivers close to them for protection. And so babies will exhibit behaviors that will keep the caregiver close. So the baby will smile, the baby will coo, and the baby will cling. And it's about triggering an affectionate and protective response from adults. Okay, because remember, the evolutionary perspective is all about securing the next generation. And so it's about that protective response from adults that the baby is trying to trigger. But probably the most predominant theorist that comes into this focus of early emotional development and attachment is Mary Ainsworth. And so she looked at trying to measure or trying to understand attachment. And so she looked at what she called was different attachment styles. So as much as we have the word attachment, like we had temperament, attachment, there's different kinds of attachment. So what she wanted to do was, the way she did it was to assess the quality of the attachment between the mother and the child. And so she had what she called the strange situation. So she observed through a window, and she had a baby and the mom playing on a mat with some toys, and she introduced a stranger into the room. And the stranger in the room sat down and also started to play, and then the mother left the room. And so what she studied was the response of the child in that moment and the response of the child when the mother returned. And by looking at that response of the child, she identified 4 different attachment styles. So the first attachment style she identified was secure. And so when the child is in the room with the mother, the child plays very happily. When the mother leaves, the child pauses and wasn't that happy. When the mom returns, the child is welcoming and returns to play. And she calls that a secure attachment style. An insecure or avoidant attachment style, when the stranger comes into the room, the child is playing happily. When the mother leaves, the mother continues to play, the child continues to play. And when the mother comes back, the child ignores the mother. Okay, and she called that kind of attachment style insecure. And then she had one called ambivalent, where the child is very clingy to the mother in the room. When the mother leaves, the child is unhappy and may stop playing. And when the mother returns, the child gets angry, might even hit the mother or cling to the mother, but very responsive. And a disorganized type of attachment is even when the mother is in the room, the child is very cautious. When the mom leaves, the child may yell, look confused, or look scared. And when the mum returns, the child acts very oddly, screams, hits themselves, and throws things. So it's called a very disorganized attachment style. But the majority of children fall into that secure attachment. So between 50 and 70% of children generally fall into secure attachment. But she identified these attachment styles as part of the emotional development of a child. So in summary, maternal behavior has an influence on the type of attachment that arises between the mother and an infant. So how the mother reacts and responds influences that type of attachment. So if you think of a mother who has a baby and suffers from postnatal depression, okay, sometimes during those critical months of a child's life, the mother may not be able to engage with her child in a way that promotes a secure attachment. So very much the maternal behavior. And again, the temperament of the child has an impact on attachment. So if you have a child that's born and is very fussy, has got that very fussy kind of temperament, doesn't want to sleep, doesn't want to eat, that can also impact on attachment because the mother would get frustrated, stressed, okay, and that can really damage the relationship between a mother and a child. So if you have a parent who's responsive and sensitive, you teach the child that the world is predictable and they can explore. If you have a kind of parent who's unresponsive and insensitive, children don't venture far and will demand attention. And again, culture has a role here. So there's different cultural variations. Secure attachments are predominant around the world. But where we find ourselves in dire sort of economic circumstances, where we're struggling just to put food on the table and to raise other children, maybe a large family, it can undermine that process of attachment. So as much as we have most of our children in the secure attachment bracket, there are significant influences that can impact on that emotional development of a child and their emotional regulation. So now we move on to language, and please just shout if I'm going too fast for you. Are you okay? Because there is a bit to get through. So one of the areas which is critical in child development is their language development. And again, there are milestones for language development. And when we think about child language acquisition, we're thinking about how language is gained. So it's gaining the language, gaining the words, and how it is developed. So as soon as babies are born, the minute they're out of the womb, they start to interact with the people around them, and their journey towards learning and using language starts. So children hear things inside the womb, but the minute that they are born, that's where their journey with language begins. And when we talk about language, language can be spoken, written, pictorial, it can be signed, and it can be used to make relationships, plan, solve problems, and all sorts of things. So it's a big component of child development, and it's the most remarkable thing that separates us from other mammals. Okay, so it's usually, when we talk about language development, it's usually linked to the child's native language, their home language, but often additional languages can be learnt at birth. So within language, and we don't really touch on this, but just to show you from different perspectives, there are different theorists around language. Skinner is our behaviorist, and he says that a child believed if a child used a correct word for drink and the child would be rewarded, okay, then they would repeat that word. We have Chomsky, who basically believes that people are born into different social environments, and there's a natural language acquisition device that children have in their brains that allows them to acquire language. And we also have Piaget, and we'll go more into Piaget shortly, but he believed that language acquisition is part of learning as a whole, and children need support at different ages. He's very much a stage theorist, and at certain ages, different support is required. in order for language to develop. Okay, so those are a couple of the theorists. So when we look at language development and we talk about learning to communicate, okay, so that is how we communicate with other people, we find that in development, regardless of where we find ourselves, whatever environment we find ourselves in, development of language occurs at roughly the same pace, okay, regardless of where you're from. Therefore, there has to be a biological maturation component more so than personal experience. But personal experience does contribute by the fact that parents who are more responsive to attempts to communicate generally foster rapid early language development, which is the amount and the diversity of child-directed speech that they provide to the child. So it's very much a biological process. But again, the environment that a child is in can promote this process of language development. So again, we have our developmental milestones with children in language development. So at 3 months, they're cooing and gurgling. 6 months, we call it babbling. Okay, we can't understand what they're saying, but sounds are coming out of their mouths. 12 months, they start to learn their first few words. And from 18 months, really their vocabulary grows, okay, to a point where by 5 years old, they have a good vocabulary and are talking in constructed sentences. So the way the language develops, or the learning to communicate develops, is we have our first phase, which is where we move towards producing words. So it's the movement towards making sound structures in your native language. So when we babble, when babies babble, they're starting to try to resemble the language that's spoken by their parents and what's in their immediate environment, because that's what they are surrounded by. And they start to repeat frequently used words. So you say, mama, 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 when you want your child to recognize you. Those are the kinds of the words that the babies will produce first, because you're repeating it quite frequently to the child. Okay. Generally those, and when you listen to the word mama or dada, those are words with sounds that are very easy to produce. Okay, and sometimes we often now have households that are bilingual, and there can be what we call code switching, where we move between different languages even in a home, which can also impact on moving towards producing some of those early words. Then the next phase is where they actually start to use words. So they're starting to comprehend more than what's actually spoken, but they're starting to recognize these words and internalize them, and then start to think to use them. At about 18 months, you have that big vocab spurt. And that's where it's really important, where we start to build vocabulary in those preschool years, because that's really where that larger language development process starts to take place. And the final stage is where they start to put words into a sentence, but they often leave out those words that are non-essential. So want drink, not I would like a drink, it's want drink. They leave out what's non-essential, but then they start to express their ideas more. And so again, culture coming into this provides the context in which language acquisition takes place. So within your own home, within your own family, within your own language group, within your own culture, there are certain traditions. Maybe it's sounds, maybe it's rhythms, maybe it's patterns of speech. This can also impact on the way the child communicates, okay, and those different stages of language development. And often the first words that a child utters are often tied to objects and concepts that are very culturally significant to children, because that's what they see in the environment around them, and that is what is repeated to them. Okay, does that give you an overview of language? And it's just a case of understanding how that progression takes place across those different phases of learning to communicate. Okay, right. So this is just a little bit of extra reading. That research still strongly suggests the family environment children are born into is crucial and early interactions have a great impact on child's learning and development. If a baby or young child has had the pleasure of listening to conversations, and when they're able to, joining in with them, has singing times and are introduced to a variety of different places, the chances of them gaining a richer vocabulary are significantly greater. Okay, so as soon as the baby is born, they learn to work out how to communicate. So the very first form of communication is that cry the minute they come out of the womb, but then gradually learn to regulate their voices and begin to use gestures, and that is when there's rapid growth. Okay, so it's not long that the baby can learn to gain attention of the adults. So they'll be thinking a little bit about attachment theory and how language can be used in attachment theory for whatever reason. When babies and young children have a strong bond and are secure in their environment, their future foundations for learning will be most secure. Okay, and they can acquire skills to express their wishes. It could be argued that all the theories on language acquisition have their own merit. Okay, so there are various theories, but it's safe to say that acquiring language is a completely natural skill that humans are born with. All research agrees that acquiring language in the earliest years of life plays a significant role in learning and developing in later years. So it's critical to that foundational growth for later life. And babies and young children who've had more exposure to language are more likely to acquire language rather than having to learn it in later in life. And it says that the most, I think, under the age of 5 is the best time to teach a child a second language. Okay, it's the easiest time for a child to start engage with another language. All right, that's language. Are you with me? Very quiet. We're going to move on to some of these theorists now, and I'm pretty certain we had one of these in our exam last semester for this module. So, and I think there's one in your assignment. So I think it's quite critical you just understand these different theorists and what they have to say about some of these developmental processes in childhood. So this is where we talk about personality development in childhood, as well as cognitive development, which is our ability to think and solve problems and reason. So Erik Erikson is a critical theorist, and his theory doesn't just span early childhood. His theory spans all the way through to late adulthood as well. But in the beginning, we're just going to focus on what he says about childhood. And he had a stage theory. So remember, we defined stages. In his role, he's thinking about personality, and it's a stage theory of personality development. So he assumes, like we said with stages, that everybody must move through the specified stages in a particular order because each stage builds on the previous one. And it also assumes that stage is strongly related to age, and development is marked by major discontinuities that bring out dramatic changes in behavior. So Erikson says, or he theorized, that there are 8 stages of psychosocial development that span all the way across our lifespan. Okay, and this is what influences our personality development. And in every stage, there's a psychosocial crisis, the outcome of which determines the balance between opposing polarities. Okay, I'll explain this on the next slide. Okay, so in that slide, I've got a better picture on the next slide, but it just shows you we move through these 8 different stages, and each stage there's a psychosocial crisis, and the way the person deals with that shapes their personality that involves transitions in important social relationships. So each stage has got 2 tendencies that are basically opposite to each other. And how that stage is negotiated and which tendency then is the predominant tendency will have an impact on shaping personality. So here are the different stages, okay? Starting in infancy, 0 to 18 months roughly is the age. And the very first thing a child deals with is the conflict between trust and mistrust. So how the child negotiates this stage will lead to an outcome of a child developing a sense of trust So how is trust developed? Trust is developed through caregivers providing responsive care. So it's around feeding, around comforting, and it's allowing the child to ask the question, is my world safe? And if the child perceives themselves to be in a world that's safe and their basic needs are being met, they will develop a sense of trust. Okay? If a child doesn't mediate this phase in a scenario where they're not receiving those basic comforts or those basic things that they need to survive, it can lead to a child developing a personality that's based around mistrust. And the minute you have mistrust, that will have various repercussions on other relationships you have. So how the child negotiates this phase will lead to either an outcome of a trusting personality or a mistrustful personality. Okay, so important events there are feeding and generally caregivers providing comfort to the child in order to say, is my world safe? The next stage happens between the ages of about 2 and 3, and the child goes through this phase where they're dealing with autonomy, which means being independent, or shame and doubt. So key activities that happen in this phase is where the independence of the child is encouraged through things like toilet training. The child can now use the toilet on their own. They can dress themselves. Okay, so you're developing this ability in the child that they can become independent. Can I do things by myself, or am I always going to rely on others? So during this phase, children need to develop a sense of personal control over physical skills and a sense of independence. Success in this phase leads to a feeling of autonomy and independence. If a child can't get through this phase, it can lead to feelings of shame and doubt. So for example, the more protective the mother is over the child, I will lay your clothes out in the morning, let me help you dress, really not encouraging them to be independent, leads to an outcome where a child cannot progress feeling shame and doubt, and that is what shapes their personality. Preschool years is that phase of initiative versus guilt, where we encourage children to play and explore and venture out into the world. And the key question that the child tries to answer itself here is, am I good or am I bad? So children need to begin asserting control and power over what's around them. Okay, and if they can do that, it leads to a sense of purpose. Children who try to exert too much power experience disapproval. Okay, and that sense of disapproval can lead to a feeling or sense of guilt. So how the stage is negotiated, those opposing things are initiative. Am I good or am I bad? Can I explore? Leads to that initiative taking. Otherwise, children are left with a feeling of sense of guilt. And the final stage in childhood is industry versus inferiority. And that's now the child is at school. So important events here happen in the school and different kinds of activities within their social environment. And the key question is, how can I be good? So children need to cope with new social and academic demands. Success in this phase leads to a sense of competence. So think back to when you were at school and learning how to do your first maths problem or to read and write. And if you were successful, if the teacher praised you, you had a sense of feeling of competence, which then has an impact on your personality. Okay, and if you are put down all the time and feel like you're a failure, you have that feeling of inferiority. Okay, so that's Erikson's theory of personality. He's got 8 stages, but you will see the other stages come into the other developmental phases that we discussed. But for the moment, we're just sticking with early childhood, okay, or childhood development. So we're focusing on those first 4 stages up until the age of 11. Okay, but what is important about Erikson, that everybody moves through those stages. They move through them in that fixed order, and every child everywhere would go through those same stages in terms of developing their personality. So the next theorist we come on to is Piaget. And if you study education, Piaget is very key in educational talk around how learning takes place. So Piaget is very much focused on cognition, and how cognition grows, how thinking, reasoning, remembering, problem solving happen, these patterns that take place in children. And what he says is all mental activity is inner process of the mind that lead to knowing, but cognition is also a stage theory. So children move from simpler to more complex tasks, and it's very much a function of their age. Okay, so starting right from birth up to 12 later years in life, children have to move through these stages which develop how they think, how they reason, how they solve problems. So again, because it's a stage theory, it's primarily a biological theory, that most of this happens as a developmental process that's an outcome of biology. That Piaget says that infants do not start out as cognitive beings. And his approach is constructivist, because by saying that, he says that with children, their knowledge of the world is constructed through their own activity and discovery. Therefore, by children discovering things through their own activities, their thinking, their cognition will grow and develop. It's stage theory, okay? And as cognition matures, the children uses concepts and different organizing schema to organize their thoughts and processes. So I'll unpack this a little for you. This is just an overview, okay? That it's to do with cognitive development. It is a stage theory, and it's based on the ability of children to explore their environment, which is also then linked to physical development. So as children start to be able to move more physically, then again, there are opportunities for cognitive development. So here's Piaget's stages. The first stage he has really is from birth to 2 years old, and it's called the sensory motor stage, because that is the child using their senses. Okay, they're beginning to explore. So it's coordination of the senses with motor responses. So the child is starting to interact with the environment. So the picture you've got there is often we dangle a mobile over the crib of a small child, and the child will reach up to try to touch the mobile. Okay, so it's about sensory curiosity, coordination of the senses with motor responses, sensory curiosity about the world. Language is used for demands and starting to catalog things. And the child will develop object permanence. So, you know, if you have a teddy and you put the teddy behind your back, okay, and the child is going, where's the teddy? Okay, so it's about understanding that objects can be there or they can be, and that the child will look behind your back. Okay, they realize that you've hidden the object, that objects are permanent. Okay, they don't just vanish into thin air. Then his next phase is pre-operational, which is from 2 to 7. That's where children start to develop kind of symbolic thinking. Okay, be able to represent the world in a slightly bigger way. They start to use proper sentences, and thoughts and concepts can be expressed. They start to develop imagination. So they're moving away of just what's in the senses, but they're moving towards more abstract kind of thought. Okay. They develop a process called conservation. And so conservation is where if you have a beaker of water that's a particular shape and it's filled to a certain level, and you pour that water into a different shaped beaker, we would know the volume of the water would stay the same, but the child would think that water has gone missing, that there's less water or there's more water. Okay, so it's beginning to understand that's the process of conservation, that they can start to link these things together. Then they move into a concrete operational phase between 7 and 11, where they can start to attach concepts to concrete situations. They start to really grasp time and space and quantity of things, and that those things stand alone. And then in formal operations, which is 11 years and older, this is where hypothetical reasoning starts to take place. They can start to think more theoretically, slightly more abstract logic and reasoning. Strategy, they begin to strategize, plan things. Concepts that are learned in one context can be applied in another. So the child moves through those different stages of cognitive development, starting from that very first interaction with their senses right up into later years where they can start to use abstract thought. So children, Piaget would then say to you that children are knowledge seekers who contribute to their own development. So children need to explore their world around them, and by using those senses and those gradual grasp of concepts, they contribute to their own development. So that has an impact on education. Obviously, a lot of criticism around Piaget, little interest in individual differences, which can be quite variable between children. And sometimes we do under and overestimate children's capabilities. Okay. And he also underestimated cultural variations. So Piaget is still very relevant today in education. Then we come to Vygotsky. Vygotsky comes from a different perspective completely to Piaget. Piaget says the child is the agent of change. So by the child exploring the world, the child is developing cognitively. Vygotsky says something completely different. He says cognitive development takes place through social interactions. So it's not to do with exploration and physical development and exploring the world. It's about social interactions. And those social interactions, who do they happen with? They happen with parents, with teachers, with older children, and especially people or children or somebody who is more skilled. And we call them the more knowledgeable other. So that other person in a child's life is critical in that child's development. Okay, and obviously their development of language is quite critical because this is based around social interactions. Therefore, language is crucial in this process. It's around, he talks about the development of private speech, which is used by children to plan. Often children are talking to themselves, and you see that especially in the early years. They're either talking to themselves, sitting with an object, having their own private conversation. Okay, but this development of private speech in children helps them to plan. So therefore, language is very important. So what Vygotsky says is basically, if you have a child, and even as an adult, and we can even think about ourselves as psychology students here, when we start psychology, okay, something we think this is completely out of our grasp, we don't understand it. Through my interaction with you and scaffolding you through a learning process, which we call the zone of proximal development, you start to understand and gain understanding to a point where you can work unassisted. So in education, that's a very important concept to have with children, that children have things that are out of their reach, but through scaffolding and through engagement with somebody, so my engagement with you, okay, teaching you as a teacher in this perspective, it might be in a different situation, in a social situation, but you get to a point where somebody can learn and can do something on their own. So that social interaction is critical. So the difference between Vygotsky and Piaget, so Piaget puts very little emphasis on the social context, the social cultural context, whereas Vygotsky has a very strong emphasis on the social environment. So Piaget is a cognitive constructionist, whereas Vygotsky is a social constructivist. Piaget has the stages we spoke about. Now, Vygotsky has no general stages. Okay, this is a theory that really encompasses all kinds of learning. Okay, it's not necessarily, well, it's not stage-like at all. Okay, it can be applied across multiple different experiences, and each one has their own different terms. So Piaget, and again, some of those are unpacked in your textbook. It's just a case of understanding what some of those terms mean, and it would be too long for me to go into them, but they're quite straightforward if you look at them. The role of language, Piaget, very little language required for this cognitive development. It's about exploration, whereas Vygotsky, the role of language is very critical. Okay, so if you're a teacher, the teaching implications for Piaget is you have to support children to explore their world and discover knowledge, whereas with Vygotsky, you have to establish opportunities for children to learn with teachers or a more skilled person. So you can see the difference between those two different theoretical approaches to cognitive development. And the final person we're going to look at in this is Kohlberg. And Kohlberg deals with morals. okay, and moral reasoning. So his theory focuses around how we develop morals, which is, and we talk about a moral is a sense of what's right and what is wrong. So he has, again, we're back to the word stage theory. So we know that there's got to be progression through stages. And it's a theory around moral development. And he established his theory by presenting a moral dilemma to people and looking at their responses. And by looking at their responses, he could gauge what stage of moral development they are in. So the classic, well, the question Kohlberg asked really, and this is how he based his theory, is there's a woman who's near death from cancer. One drug might save her. It's the form of radium that a doctor in the same town has recently discovered. The doctor is charging a lot for the drug, 10 times more than the medicine cost him to make. The sick woman's husband, Heinz, went to everyone he knew to borrow money, but he could only get together about half of what it cost. He told the doctor that his wife was dying and asked him to sell it at a cheaper price or let him pay later, but the doctor said no. The husband became desperate and broke into the doctor's practice to steal the medicine for his wife. Should the husband have done this? Now, your response to that scenario, okay, would tell Kohlberg at what stage of moral reasoning you are in. Okay, so there's various scenarios, and I will put these slides up for you so you can read them, okay? And I'm just concerned about time, so I'm just going to move on. So Kohlberg has these different stages, and by answering that question, he would put you into one of these stages. So he was interested in their reasoning, not their answer. So there was no judgment over the answer. Okay, he was more interested in what that answer was. And there are 3 levels of moral development. There's what he calls the pre-conventional level, the conventional level, and the post-conventional level. So he's got 3 different levels. Each level, wait for it, is broken into 2 sub-levels. So in total, we've got 6 stages, okay, of moral development. And each one of those stages represents a different way that we think about what is right or what is wrong. So our very first stage is in that pre-conventional level, and the stage is called punishment orientation. So right and wrong, and when we think about children, what is right and what is wrong is determined by what is being punished. Okay, so if you punish a child for something, and the child perceives that punishment, it will learn what is good and what is bad. Okay, it's through a direct punishment orientation. That's how children start to differentiate between what's right and what's wrong, what I get a smack for and what I get a reward for. Then they move, what they get punished for. In stage 2 is called naive reward orientation. Right or wrong is determined by what is rewarded. So the first stage is punishment. The second stage is rewarded. Is something rewarded? If it's rewarded, it must be right. Okay. The third stage is called good boy or good girl orientation, and I have put up a nice video that explains this very clearly. It's a Sprouts video, I think, and it's got some nice ways for you to understand this a bit clearer. Right or wrong is determined by approval or disapproval of others. Stage 4 is the authority orientation. Right or wrong is determined by society's rules and laws which must be obeyed. So back in the example of the Heinz dilemma, you cannot break, regardless of the fact you need this drug, regardless of the fact your wife is dying, you cannot break in. Breaking into someone's premises is wrong. It's punishable. You'll go to jail. It's about the authority orientation. And that sort of post-conventional level, we move towards what is right and what is wrong determined by society's rules, but there is some flexibility in those rules, okay? They're not absolute rules. So you would take into more of a contextual situation. Yes, it's wrong to break in, but his wife is dying, therefore why can't he break in? If the doctor is selling the drug at an overpriced rate, then, and his wife is dying, surely the fact that his wife is dying would allow him to break in this circumstance. So there's more kind of social contract orientation. And the very final stage, which very few people actually achieve, okay, right or wrong is determined by abstract ethical principles that emphasize equity and justice. So somebody who works at that pinnacle of you know, it completely boils down to justice and ethics. Someone like Nelson Mandela, for example, the Dalai Lama, is not many people reach that final stage of moral development. Most of us sit within, as we get older, within that fifth stage, that we're able to think about problems a little bit more abstractly and apply a social set of rules rather than what is laid down for us. Okay. So those are the different stages of moral development. Are you okay with Kohlberg? I have seen a question in the past in an exam where it says identify the different stages and identify which stage you are in and why you believe you're there. So as much as we're learning this theory, a lot of it also boils down to how we can interpret it from our own perspectives as well. Okay, nearly done. Then we move into adolescence. So we've done those four different theorists for childhood, cognition, language, emotion, and moral development. We've looked at some of the different theorists. Now we move into adolescence. Adolescence is the age from 10 to 19 years of age, and it's basically from puberty until a certain endpoint around the age of about 19. So obviously during adolescence, it's where our sexual maturity develops, our brain develops. We start to look around individuation, defining ourselves as individuals, okay, striving for autonomy, striving for independence, striving for freedom and mastery. And think about being a teenager between 10 and 19, and you can picture this in your head, these different, this particular age group. So very much focus around interpersonal situations. Relationships are very important. Erikson comes back in here because Erikson's got that stage of identity versus role confusion. We moved into that later adulthood in Erikson's stages. I think it's stage 5. So that's where children move through an identity crisis. Often in teenage years, you see that identity crisis taking shape. They're not sure who they should be. Are they influenced by their peers? Are they influenced by their family? What influences them? They're not too sure what they want to be, who they want to be when they grow up, etc. And we often see risk-taking behaviors. So that's what we see in that. So early adolescence. So adolescence again can be broken down into different stages. So we've got sort of 12 to 14 years. That's where we have growth spurts, very conscious of how we look and how we appear to people. And we start to question our family values. You know, moms can't quite impose those rules anymore. They will be challenged. Then you have that age of middle adolescence, 14 to 16. So they're really starting to exert independence, definitely an increase in sexual behavior. Self-esteem at that age is very important. Our peer groups are very important and very influential on our development. And we start to define ourselves as unique, but we still have relationships with our family. And the later adolescent years is basically those opportunities that give us the ability to have better sense of self and sense of belonging. So critical components of adolescence, self-esteem, okay, very important component of adolescence, our self-worth. And we get our self-worth based on our perceived success and achievements and how they're valued by others. So the engagement with people around you, what you get back from people around you, impacts on your self-esteem. Our moral development is a critical component of adolescence. It's where we really start to understand values and beliefs about codes of behavior, how we need to behave, and very much linked to our family and our environment. Imitation of others is also important. That social context, the peers around us. So we imitate. Remember the word imitation and modeling. So very much impactful in moral development. The socializing processes are critical. So being accepted into peer relationships, and we start to mature what we call our social cognition, our social way of thinking. Our self-esteem grows. How? It grows through the fact that we're viewed as competent by our peers. Okay, so peers have an impact on self-esteem. And we start to really separate ourselves from our parents by belonging to different peer groups. So that sense of belonging in the adolescence years is very important, not with the family, but with peers. And we start to, our brain, our cognition is still thinking. Okay, it's growing. We develop a more intellectual kind of thinking. We can self-regulate our thinking and our own reflective. And we have very powerful belief systems. And again, linked into that is physical development. So within adolescence, important components just to note: self-esteem, moral development, socializing, cognitive maturation, and physical development. Are you guys still okay? It's a little bit long. Are you still with me? 5 minutes. Sorry, I did warn it was a long section. Sorry. Erickson, like I said to you, Erickson comes in here, so that 13 to 21 years, that's an adolescent phase. Identity versus role confusion, like I said to you. When we talk about identity, it's not an identity document, it's various kinds of identity in those years. We're looking at our vocational identity, our intellectual identity, thinking about a political identity, a religious identity. So identity is a big word, okay? And so it encompasses, it's someone working through various identities, which you can see as a struggle for adolescents, and that's what can cause challenges. So if an adolescent can clearly start to define their own identity, okay, it leads to a unified sense of self. Okay, but if they can't establish that own identity in those critical years, it leads to ongoing role confusion. Really, who am I? Okay, so again, positive or a less desirable outcome. So identity requires exploration with the asking of profound questions. And in order to ask those profound questions, we have to be able to develop abstract reasoning. So you can see how cognition comes into play here to link with personality. Okay, so we can start to ask questions of ourselves, of our society, and all of that helps garner our identity. Angel or devil, which way? Okay, that somebody needs to start to develop abstract thinking to make those decisions. And then the expansive adulthood. So we've moved through adolescence and we say, okay, the expansive adulthood, because development is a lifelong journey. Personality is relatively stable over time through adulthood. Okay, there's very little changes in personality. As we get older, there might be some changes in some of our traits. So remember, we did personality traits. So for example, as you get older, you might become less agreeable. As you get older, you might become less open to new experiences. You might become more neurotic. So generally, our personality is stable over the expanse of our adulthood, but within certain characteristics or personality traits, there can be changes as we get older. Okay. Again, Erickson comes into place here, and he has got his last 3 phases that sit here. It's intimacy versus isolation. So in those years, sort of late 20s, where you need to bring a partner into your life, can you develop the capacity to share intimacy with others? So can you achieve that? Or if you can't achieve it, it breaks down relationships. So if we resolve that and we can share intimacy with others, it leads to empathy and openness. Okay. Otherwise, we become isolated into our old age and later years. There's the concept of generativity versus self-absorption. So we start to acquire a concern for the welfare of future generations. Is that how we want to live? Do we want to live saying that, you know, I'm concerned about how society is progressing, that I can still be productive, I can still add value to my life, to other people's lives? Or do you just become self-absorbed and stagnate, especially in those later years? Okay, even after you've finished working, you know, do you still give what you can, or do you just become self-absorbed and old and miserable? And then integrity versus despair. So it gets to a point where you avoid the tendency to dwell on mistakes of the past and imminent death. So you need to try to find meaning. So you carry on trying to find meaning and satisfaction, or do you just give up? Okay, you just despair and you give up. So you can see Erikson's stages go all the way through, and progressively then our personality is changing depending on how these different stages are resolved, right through to that last stage of integrity and despair. And as we get older, obviously there are physiological changes. Our hair falls out, we get increases in body fat, our muscle tone decreases, we get slower with our motor development. That has an impact on how we perceive ourselves. Our hearing changes, our vision changes, our hormones change. Women go through menopause. So we have all those fluctuations in later age that are physiological. But at the same time we have physiological changes, we also have neural changes in our brain. So our brain tissue actually changes, our brain weight can decline. Some of those active neurons shrink and decline. Dementia can occur, okay, where we have multiple cognitive deficits, memory impairment, and then ultimately that can be part of Alzheimer's disease. So I think we see more significantly increases in cases in dementia, but it's about our brain, our neurons actually now starting to degenerate, and we have multiple cognitive deficits. And from a psychosocial aspect of aging, okay, we have death and dying, and death can come at any stage in our life cycle, but it is generally linked to getting older. And in South Africa, our life expectancy has increased, okay, but it does have one of the highest adult mortality rates in the world because of disease. So although our life expectancy is longer, we have a higher adult mortality rate. Okay, which is often due to things like disease, poverty, poor healthcare, and things like that. So thinking about death and death itself is a critical part of the final step of that process. Okay, that's the end, everybody. Sorry it took so long. I have just put up your ICE task so you can have a quick look at it. It's just it's not a complex ICE task. It's just asking you to plot down those different theories so that you have a good understanding. The concept of ICE task is for you to engage with the material, and by engaging with the material, we're helping prepare you for the exam. So just those different theories, an overview of Erikson, Piaget, Vygotsky, and Kohlberg. You just need to provide an overview of each of those theories to show that you've got a good grasp of what they mean. Apologies for the lengthy session. Next one, I promise, won't be so long. Are there any questions? Everyone's been very quiet. I hope you're actually all still there. Are you good? Can I let you go and enjoy your evening? I have put the ICE task due date on the calendar, Danica. It's generally 2 weeks after the collab, so it gives you time to engage with the material. So I did put the dates on there for each of the ICE tasks. So they are there. Okay, it's a lot, guys, but hopefully that's given you a good place to get to grips with the content. So yeah, I will post some messages and announcements and keep you up to date with where you should be. But any questions, you've got my email address. Contact me on the link on VC Learn, and I'll put the recording up tomorrow. Okay, anyone with children might learn a lot from this learning unit. Or if you don't have children, by the time you have children, you'll know a lot. So that's always a good learning unit. It's secure attachment. No, the child is safe and unharmed. The child is safe in a secure attachment with a sensitive parents. Okay, there are videos, so if you need any more help, there are some good video links for you too. Take care, everybody. Keep warm.